The settlement of Timorsk did not truly appear on any official map. Most trains passed through it without stopping, and most people who lived outside Siberia had never heard its name. It was a thin stretch of houses along a lonely line of freight tracks, surrounded by miles of dark pine that never seemed to end. Winter came early here, and even in late autumn the wind could cut through the heaviest coat like a blade. On a silent night in early November, freight train number 1412 crawled along those rails. The engineer, an aging man named Arthur, squinted through the frosted window as the headlight cut through the maze of falling snow. Beside him sat his younger assistant, Ilya, who was already counting the minutes until they were clear of Timorsk. The place made him uneasy. It always did. They were roughly a kilometer from the settlement when Ilya leaned forward and pointed. He muttered a shaky word that Arthur did not hear at first. There was something on the tracks, far ahead, lying to still to be a log or fallen branch. Arthur pulled the horn and hit the emergency brakes, but a loaded freight train never stopped when you needed it to. Both men braced as the engine plowed through the obstruction, and the sickening thud that followed left them staring at each other in dread. When the train finally groaned to a halt, Arthur took a lantern and climbed down. Ilya reluctantly followed. The snow had begun to fall harder, muting the sound of their boots on the steel rails. The lantern light swayed as Arthur raised it and froze. The remains on the tracks did not resemble an accident. 3 bodies lay arranged in a straight line across the rails, as if someone had placed them there with deliberate care. Their limbs were positioned unnaturally tidy, palms resting against their chests, faces turned upward toward the sky. Arthur stepped back, whispering a prayer under his breath. The men contacted the dispatcher, and within the hour, 2 investigators and a railway medic arrived from the nearest station. Among them was Lena Voronina, who had seen her share of injuries over the years but had never witnessed anything like this. She knelt beside one of the bodies and examined the skin. It held no warmth. Dmitry Volkov, the lead investigator, approached quietly. He was tall, weary-eyed, and carried a notebook filled with years of unsolved oddities from remote regions. Timorsk already felt like another one of those places where answers hid behind silence. Lena spoke softly. These 3 were from the nearby village of Borzin. They had been missing for 4 days. She looked up at Dmitry. This placement is wrong. They were not struck here. Dmitry nodded. He had noticed the same detail. There was very little blood near the rails. Not enough for a fresh fatality. The bodies had been moved. The villagers began to gather near the station lights. None of them stepped close. Their faces were tight with fear, and no one offered any theories. When Dmitry questioned them, their answers came short and nervous. They had heard nothing, seen nothing, and they wanted the investigators gone as soon as possible. Dmitry walked farther down the track, scanning the ground. The snow was fresh and soft, and he expected to see human footprints leading to or from the bodies. Instead, he found only a strange set of impressions in the snow near the tree line. They were deep, wide, and oddly shaped, almost like the tracks of something standing on long, narrow limbs. They did not match any animal he knew. As he bent to study them, Lena called to him. She was holding something she had retrieved near the sleepers. It was a small wooden icon, carved crudely by hand. The front bore a symbol that neither of them recognized. The wood was smeared with something dark and dried. Dmitry felt a prickle crawl up his spine. He closed his notebook slowly. The villagers were watching them with an intensity he could feel even without turning. And behind them, the forest stood still and silent, as if waiting. The next morning came with a sky the color of frozen steel. Timorsk looked even smaller in daylight. The cluster of houses huddled together as if trying to keep warm against the endless taiga that surrounded them. Not a single chimney smoked. Dmitry found that odd. People here preferred to stay indoors, especially during early winter. Yet no one seemed to be lighting stoves. Lena met him at the rail depot, her breath drifting in pale clouds. She had barely slept. The images from the tracks refused to leave her mind. She kept replaying the arrangement of the bodies, the empty eyes staring upward, the unnatural calm of their positions. Even the icon she had found disturbed her. It now sat in a sealed evidence bag inside Dmitry's coat pocket. Dmitri began his interviews immediately. The villagers opened their doors only after long pauses, and when they did, they kept their eyes low, offering curt answers. Everything they said felt rehearsed. They had been asleep. They heard no train. They heard no screams. They did not know. The three from Borzino had even passed through Timorsk recently. No one knew anything, and no one wanted to. Only one man seemed willing to speak at length. He was tall, thin, and pale, with a tired voice and hands that shook faintly. His name was Sergei. He invited them into his small wooden home, though he kept glancing at the windows as if listening for someone. Outside, Sergei poured weak tea and spoke without waiting for questions. He told them he had lived in Timorsk his entire life and that the forest had always been strange. He said the older generations never went too deep into it, not even in summer. He described nights when the wind carried voices that did not sound like voices, and shapes moved between the trees that did not walk like animals. Dmitri wrote quickly, though he suspected he was listening to folklore rather than testimony. But Lena sat forward. She sensed something different in Sergei's tone. He was not sharing myths. He was confessing fear. Sergei hesitated before mentioning the legend. The villagers called it the Watcher of the Black Pines. Not a creature exactly, but something that saw anyone who wandered too far during winter nights. He lowered his voice as he said it. No one should be on the tracks after dusk. He pressed his hands together, and no one should hear their name whispered in the woods. Dmitri asked him directly if he believed the deaths were the work of an animal or a person. Sergei looked toward the forest and shook his head. You're asking the wrong question. The right one is why they were left on the tracks at all. The room felt colder after he spoke. Lena swallowed. The symbol on the icon, she whispered. Do you know what it means? Sergei's answer came too fast. No, and he refused to speak further about it. They left his home uneasy. The villagers watched them again from behind curtains. The silence had weight now, a heavy layer pressing on the air. Later that evening, Dmitri walked the perimeter of the settlement. The sun fell early, turning the sky into a dark violet haze. He examined the area where he had found the strange footprints the night before. Fresh ones were there again, circling in wide, uneven arcs. The snow around them was slightly melted, as if warmed by something passing through. Lena approached with the portable case that held the recovered belongings of the victims. She had spent the afternoon cataloging them. Nothing unusual. No alcohol. No weapons. No signs they had been traveling through Timorsk at all. Their last known route should have taken them far south of this place. There was no reason for them to be in these woods. As the two of them spoke, a sudden sound broke the stillness. It came from deep between the pines, faint but distinct. A long dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the frozen ground. Lena stepped closer to Dmitri. Her voice trembled. Did you hear that? He nodded. Stay behind me. The dragging sound stopped. Then the forest went silent again. The type of silence that had texture, as if waiting for a response. They walked back toward the depot. A lone lantern cast dim light on the snow. A flicker caught Lena's eye. A dark streak across the ground. Near the storage shed, she followed it instinctively and felt her stomach twist. It was blood, fresh, thick enough to glisten. There were tracks beside. It's human, but only one set leading into the woods. Dmitri crouched and inspected the footprints. The right shoe had a worn heel. He recognized it, Sergei Malinov's, but there were no returning footprints, just a straight line of his steps. Walking out of Timorsk, and a long smear in the snow where something had dragged after him. Dmitri stood slowly. Lena clutched her coat. There was no sound from the woods now. Nothing except the cold whisper of the wind sliding through the black pines. It felt like the forest was swallowing Sergei's trail. Already the Watcher, Sergei had said, the one that never sleeps. Dmitri felt the first true chill of fear settle in his chest. Something in Timorsk was hunting. The search for Sergei began at dawn, though dawn looked more like a dim bruise spreading over the sky. Timorsk sat in a hush so deep that even the crows avoided its rooftops. Dmitri and Lena prepared quietly, layering their clothes and checking their small packs. They carried only what they could manage in the forest: lanterns, a radio, rope, and a few flares. No villagers offered help. When Dmitri requested volunteers, doors stayed shut. Faces peered from behind curtains, then retreated as though he had asked them to walk willingly into a grave. Lena noticed how the villagers placed small bundles wrapped in cloth along the tracks before sunrise, each package tied with thin twine. She did not open any of them. She did not want to see what they held. The trail leading into the pines remained faint but visible. Sergei's tracks continued for nearly 30 meters, then veered sharply to the right. The snow beside them held the long smear of something heavy being pulled. Dmitri moved slowly, eyes scanning for movement, ears tuned for any wrong sound. Lena walked close behind. She carried the evidence bag with the wooden icon. She did not know why she brought it, only that she felt strange leaving it behind. Sometimes it warmed slightly in her hands, though she told herself it was her imagination. The forest deepened quickly. The trees grew taller, their trunks dark as old bones. No wind reached them here. The world became still, mute, closed off. Dmitri stopped at a wide clearing where the footprints simply ended. The smear continued forward. He crouched low, running a gloved hand over the indentation drag marks. Something had hauled Sergei from this point onward. Lena whispered, almost too softly to hear. Could he still be alive? Dmitri did not answer. Survival out here was already unlikely. Being dragged made it worse. But he could not give up. They moved deeper. The drag marks twisted between the trees, stopping near an old trench filled with brittle grass. At its edge, half buried in the snow, sat a rusted metal plate. Dmitri brushed it clean. Faded letters and old paint spelled out a forgotten number. Lena knelt beside him. This was part of something bigger, a structure underneath. They found the entrance 20 steps later. It was a sunken door, metal and warped, covered by branches someone had placed intentionally. Dmitri lifted the debris and forced the door open with effort. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the faint smell of chemicals and rot. They descended a ladder into the earth. The bunker walls were concrete, sweating with moisture. Old wires drooped like dead vines. Fluorescence tubes hung cracked and useless. Lena shone her lantern down the hallway. We should turn back. But they could not. The smear led straight inside. Every footstep echoed, bouncing through the corridors. Doors lined both walls, some open, some locked. Dmitri peered inside one room. Metal tables stood in rows, each fitted with restraints that had rusted nearly through. Broken glass jars littered the floor. Some still held murky liquid. Lena picked up a recording device from a table. The battery was dead, but a tape remained inside. She pocketed it. Further in, they found old notebooks. Dmitri flipped through the pages. Most entries were coded, but a few lines were readable. Exposure leads to sensory distortion. Prolonged proximity causes hallucination. Subject reports hearing voices calling its name from outside. Lena single quotes as hands shook. This place was trying to study something, and maybe contain it. The drag marks finally ended at a doorway, half caved in by collapsed concrete. Dmitri squeezed through first, then pulled Lena after him. The chamber beyond was large and circular, once a testing room. The remains of machinery lay scattered, but at the center sat something far more recent. Sergei. He slumped against the far wall, legs folded under him at unnatural angles. His head rested forward, chin on his chest. Dmitri rushed to him and reached for a pulse. None. The skin felt cold, too cold for someone who had died recently. Lena pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to look away. But Sergei's eyes were open. They stared past her, wide with terror, pupils stretched thin like slits. Lena backed away. She wanted to call for Dmitri, but her breath caught in her throat. A sound rose behind her. Soft, rhythmic. Footsteps, not human footsteps. Long strides, uneven, dragging slightly at the end of each step, like limbs bending at the wrong angles. Dmitri turned slowly. His lantern trembled. Something stood in the doorway. Its shape was wrong, tall and narrow, with limbs that bent inward first before extending outward again. Its head tilted, listening to the sound of their breathing. It had no clear face, only shifting pale skin, as if the features changed beneath the surface. Lena felt her knees weaken. The icon in her pocket pulsed with heat against her leg. The thing stepped forward. The room chilled instantly. Dmitri fired a flare. The burst of red light filled the chamber, and the creature recoiled sharply, twisting its limbs in a contortion that made Lena choke on a sob. Run! Dmitri shouted. They fled through the corridor, stumbling over debris, hearts pounding like gunfire. They climbed the ladder and burst into the forest as the bunker door slammed shut behind them with a deep thud. The footprints of the creature followed only halfway out of the bunker before stopping. It would not leave the underground. But as they reached the edge of Morsk, Dmitri saw villagers placing more bundles along the tracks. The people kept their eyes lowered as if expecting punishment. Lena clutched his arm tightly. They knew, she whispered. This whole time, they knew. And as the wind carried a faint dragging sound from the pines, Dmitri understood why so many cases here closed as accidents. No one wanted to admit what lived in the Taiga. Timor would bury this truth again, as it always had, and the tracks would keep receiving their offerings, just as they had for decades.